something over here. Somebody's awake at least. All right, if y'all would stand, we're going to do a couple of worship songs. The first one is Mansion Over the Hilltop. It's Wendy's favorite.
And y'all are going to sing out.
Y'all are going to sing. We're still a little
because we're a little froggy still.
A little still. So y'all going to sing that with us.
I'm satisfied with just a cottage below, a little silver and a little gold. But in that city where the ransom will shine, I want a gold one, that silver. Don't think me poor or deserted or lonely, 'cause I'm not discouraged. I'm heaven bound. I'm just a pilgrim in search of a city, and I want a mansion, a harp and a just over the hilltop, in that bright land where we'll never grow. And someday yonder we will never more wander, but walk on streets that are pure as gold. Let's sing that one more time. 'Cause I've got a mansion just over the hilltop, in that bright land where we'll never grow. And someday yonder we will never more wander, but walk on streets that are pure as gold. Good job. Y'all hung in there. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul, worship His holy name, sing like never before, oh my soul, I'll worship Your holy name. The sun comes up, it's a new day dawning. It's time to sing Your song again. Sing like never before. Oh, my soul, I'll worship your holy name. You're rich in love and you're slow to anger. Your name is great and your heart is kind. For all your goodness I will keep on singing. 10,000 reasons for my heart to find. So bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul. Worship his holy name. Sing like never before. Oh my soul, I'll worship your holy name. And on that day when my strength is failing, the end draws near and my time has come. Still my soul will sing your praises unending. 10,000 years and then forevermore. So bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul. Worship his holy name. You sing like never before. Oh my soul, I'll worship your holy name. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul. Worship his holy name. And sing like never before. Oh my soul, I'll worship your holy name. I'll worship your holy name. Lord, I'll worship your holy name. Amen.
You can be seated.
All right, good to see everybody here tonight. I'm glad that you're here. Turn with me to the book of Esther. As we complete that study tonight, we're going to look at Esther chapter 9 and chapter 10, but mostly chapter 9 because chapter 10 is just a brief paragraph long. You might wonder why they would have a chapter 10 or why do they put it in chapter 10. Why not just put it on the end of chapter 9? There is a reason logically, and we'll see that when we get there, but it is extraordinarily brief. So for all practical purposes, we're looking at a single chapter tonight, so it should be fairly efficient. Before we get to there, and this is, I won't say an epilogue, that's not really fair to chapter 9 because it is action-packed. In just a few minutes, 80,000 people are going to die. It's an interesting chapter. It is really a culmination of everything that happened in chapters 1 through 8. If you have not been with us, in 587, Nebuchadnezzar, 587 BC, before Christ, Nebuchadnezzar came through with his army into Jerusalem and destroyed it, destroyed the Temple of Solomon, the walls, everything. Took the people who were healthy enough to make the trip and hauled them all back to Babylon as what intended to be slaves. Within a single generation, the Babylonian Empire really fell and was transitioned into the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great initially. And now we see a Persian king there. His name is Xerxes. And again, there are a couple of names for him, but for practical purposes, I'll call him Xerxes. And that's probably what he's best known for historically, at least in our language, is the name Xerxes. There are Jews that were allowed to go back under Cyrus, if you remember, and rebuild Jerusalem. Ezra led a group of people back who was really a spiritual reformer, and did so many wonderful things in his leadership. Zerubbabel led a group of people back to rebuild the temple, Nehemiah led a group of people back to rebuild the wall around Jerusalem. And as those things have happened, many of the Jews have now gone back to Jerusalem or that area to reclaim and rebuild their country. But not everyone. There are still many, many Jews living in the Persian Empire, and that facilitates our story out of the book of Esther. Two of those Jews, Esther and we'll call him her stepfather, a man named Mordecai. Mordecai worked at the temple gates, and the palace gates, and he overheard two of the guards talking about overthrowing and killing King Xerxes. He told on them, they were executed, and Mordecai's bravery and willingness to save the life of King Xerxes was forgotten for a while. In the middle of all of that, he had a beautiful stepdaughter named Esther, and the king needed a wife, and there was a calling or a beauty pageant, you might say, for all the women in the territory or in the kingdom. And it was a vast kingdom at this point that were brought in. And in the end, King Xerxes liked Esther the best and married her. And I think he did love her. Remember, Xerxes was a hedonistic narcissist himself. He was not a godly man, but God used him for his own purposes. And so Esther is now the queen, and Mordecai is there at the gates, and there is a man named Haman who is second in charge of the kingdom. And every time Haman came out, everybody was to bow. As you know the story, Mordecai refused to bow to him. That made Haman very angry. He decided to execute Mordecai, the Jew. But he was so angry and so filled with hatred to Mordecai, he decided not only to kill Mordecai, but to kill all the Jews. So he kind of went in and tricked King Xerxes into permitting this edict, gave Haman his signet ring that he could use the official king's seal, and who sent out posters all over the kingdom saying at the end of this year, we're going to execute all of the Jews. It's open season on the Jews. And Mordecai found out about that. He's horrified, of course. He goes to tell Queen Esther. And by the way, their nationality is hidden. It's a secret at this point. King Xerxes does not know his own wife is Jewish. And while people do know, Mordecai is Jewish, by the way. Anyway, so she goes to the king. Long story short, she pleads on behalf of her people for the Jews, and at the same time uncovers this deceptive plot from Haman. And as a result, Xerxes is furious. He has Haman executed, hung from the gallows that Haman had built for Mordecai. And so Haman gets killed last week. We saw that, and everything goes well, and everybody lives happily ever after. But there is another chapter, and this is interesting what happens after King Xerxes allows this edict to go throughout the country to say, all right, that first edict is overruled by this new edict. I've decided I like the Jews since my wife is a Jew, and I think you should like them too. And when this day comes, I'm giving the permission to the Jews to defend themselves from anybody that would attack them. And then it became very popular to be pro-Jewish in the kingdom, but it was not universal. We're going to find out tonight. There were people in the kingdom like Haman who hated Jews and couldn't wait until this date came up, and they were going to go after the Jews. And so there are a lot of battles that take place in this final chapter 9 and 10, and we're going to look at that right now. Look with me in chapter 9, verse 1. On the 13th day of the 12th month, that's the day they were originally supposed to all be executed. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. The enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned, And the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those seeking their destruction. No one could stand against them because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and kings, administrators, helped the Jews because fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. The Jews struck down all of their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed, okay, here we go. Yes, I want to say parachute, dolphin, anyway, it's Parashadatha, dolphin, Aspatha, Paratha, Adaliah, Aridatha, Parmashta, or Arisai, Aridai, I assume, yeah, and Vizaltha. Ooh, my head hurts. The 10 sons of Haman. It couldn't have just said that. The 10 sons of Haman, son of Hamadatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. It mentioned that they killed them, that we're going to see how they killed them here in just a moment. Verse 11, the number of those slain in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king that same day. The king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? It will also be granted. If it pleases the king, Esther answered, give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on gallows. So they took their bodies and impaled them up for everybody to see. Verse 14, so the king commanded that this be done. An edict was issued in Susa, and they hanged the 10 sons of Haman. The Jews in Susa came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they put to death in Susa 300 men, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and to get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay their hands on the plunder. So if you do the math, they killed 75,000 here at the end. Previously, just before that, they killed 500 and 300. So that's a total of 800. And then the 10 sons of Haman, this is my math, is 75,810, if you're counting. That's a lot of people. The Jewish men were organized and armed at this point, ready to meet any enemy who would attack them and their families and try to take their possessions. But the Lord had given them a greater weapon than their swords, because the fear of the Jews fell upon them. That's in chapter 8, verse 17, and also in this chapter, verse 2. This was a fear that God had sent into the hearts of the Gentiles to keep them from fighting his people. By the way, my commentary tonight is the Bible Exposition Commentary. I love that commentary. The fear of God protects those who fear God and believe in his promises, because the Jews believed Mordecai's decree. They had new courage and were not afraid of the enemy, and their courage put fear into the hearts of their enemy. Before King Jehoshaphat went out to battle, God's message to him was, and this is from 2 Chronicles 20:20, says, believe in the Lord your God, and you shall be established. Believe his prophets, and you shall prosper. And that is still wise counsel. And I'll give them credit for this. The Jews were ready for the day. They mustered their faith and took courage, and God gave them victory. I'm a little surprised at how many in the kingdom hated the Jews still. 75,000 that were willing to fight and die because they hated the Jews so much. But there was another aspect, by the way, to this fear. They didn't just fear the Jews in general. They did that. But it was also their fear of Mordecai. Did you notice that? In verse 3, it specifically mentioned the people were afraid of Mordecai because he had grown so powerful in the kingdom. So they were afraid of the Jews, also afraid of Mordecai. The princes, deputies, governors, and officers of the king throughout the empire were in such awe of Mordecai that they even helped the Jews defend themselves against the Persians. God had given Mordecai his high position and his great reputation, and Mordecai used his authority to do the will of God. I find myself wondering if there were no Esther, if there was no Mordecai. I assure you, those people who hated the Jews were still there. I find myself wondering, had there been no Esther and no Mordecai, and had she not married the king and the edict had not gone out that they were now pro-Jews, and they had people to help them and arm them and prepare them for this day, I find myself wondering if not the Jews would have been eradicated at some point in the future from those who hated Jews in the region. God may very well have used Mordecai and Esther just for the sole purpose that this second edict would go out and everybody knew that the king was pro-Jewish, to muster the strength to eradicate the enemies of the Jews. The Jews needed help against their enemies, and God provided it through Esther and Mordecai and this entire book. I'm just wondering. I don't know what would have happened, but I'm suspicious that God did this for that very reason. The Persians who attacked the Jews were actually cooperating with Haman, even though he was already dead, and this made them enemies of God. In slaying those who attacked them, the Jews were only doing to the enemy what King Saul had refused to do in 1 Samuel chapter 15. He was supposed to wipe them out, and he didn't. Since the Jews were not the aggressors, it means that the 10 sons of Haman had taken up arms and attacked the Jews, and all 10 of them were slain. The body of the 10 sons were hanged on Haman's gallows as a warning to the enemy. By the way, in the text of the Hebrew Scriptures, the 10 names that I struggled to read to you, the 10 names are arranged on the page in the Hebrew Scriptures to look like a gallows. On the Feast of Purim, the synagogue reader reads these 10 names all in one breath because the same sons of Haman all died together. And we'll talk about the Feast of Purim in just a little bit. All right, verse 17. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the 13th and 14th, and then on the 15th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. So most of the Jews finished in one day, but one group of Jews there in Susa, it took them 2 days. And so there became this kind of confusion shortly about when to celebrate. Verse 19, that is why rural Jews, those living in villages, observe the 14th of the month of Adar as a day of joy and feasting, a day for giving presents to each other. Which, by the way, I find interesting. They, it's not their Christmas, but they give gifts to one another. So to celebrate the slaughter of 75,000 people, they give presents to each other. I'm not sure how that's connected. I just find that interesting. Verse 20, Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the month of Adar as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another. And now we see this added, and gifts to the poor. They do this to this very day, by the way. Verse 23, so the Jews agreed to continue the celebration they had begun, doing what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them and had cast the pur, that is the lot, for their ruin and destruction. But when the plot came to the king's attention, he issued written orders that the evil scheme Haman had devised against the Jews should come back into his own head, that he and his sons should be hanged in the gallows. Therefore, these days were called Purim, from the word pur, or pur. I don't know how they pronounced it. Because of everything written in this letter and because of what they had seen and what had happened to them, the Jews took it upon themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants, all who joined them, should without fail observe these 2 days every year in the way prescribed and at the time appointed. Now, back to the word pur, it's the Feast of Purim to this day, and because it has the word pur or pure in it, that came from, it already explained, the dice. Do you remember when Haman decided to execute all the Jews? He went to this soothsayer person because he wanted to get the lucky day to kill them, and so this person apparently rolled the dice, and it came out to being that day in December at the end of the year. And that's how that day was set. And so it was because of the dice, the pur or the pur. And so that's why it's called the Feast of Purim. All right, verse 28. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation by every family and in every province and every city. And these days of Purim should never cease to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of them die out among their descendants. So Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter concerning Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Xerxes, words of goodwill and assurance to establish these days of Purim as their designated times, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had decreed for them, and as they had established for themselves and their descendants in regard to their times of fasting and lamentation. Esther's decree confirmed these regulations about Purim, and it was written down in the records. And so you see really two things coming out of chapter 9. That is the day of vindication or the day of protection, where the Jews had victory over their enemies, and then the celebration that was established for thousands of years now as a result of God delivering his people. It's sad when a nation or a church forgets its heroes and the providential events that have kept it alive. How easy it is for a new generation to come along and take for granted the blessings that previous generations struggled and sacrificed to attain. One of the saddest things I can tell you as the pastor of First Baptist Church, which was founded in 1904, is that literally 95% of all of our history is gone. I can't tell you the names, but only, and I've been here for 25 years, other than me, I can't tell you the names, but only a couple of pastors. Pastor Stott, back in 1961, when the building across the street was built. The pastor before me, who was P.K. Wilson, J.K. Wood was before him, and a few of our old timers here can tell you a few more names than that, but most of the history of our church is long forgotten. I can tell you this church was a very small church over the years. In fact, when I came here, they told me historically the church ran about 35. For decades and decades and decades, it tended to float around 35, sometimes less, sometimes more. One of the ladies told me that when she was young, she was a little girl, she remembers there would be 15 or 20 at most. And so it came in a way, just very small, struggling churches. And if I could go back in time, which of course is silly, I can't, but if I could go back in time to the 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s, 30s, and visit this church, I would say to that little tiny congregation in all of those decades and throughout those generations, I want you to know that God has amazing plans for this church. Don't give up. But amazingly, God doesn't need me to go back in time. I wish he did, but he doesn't need me to go back in time. His Spirit encouraged the members of this church, gave them the fortitude that they needed to do the ministry of God, and God preserved the church, protected the church, and blessed the church to the church that it is right now. Sunday, and I'm going to brag just a little bit, we have 477 in worship, which in a January, where everybody is sick, by the way, that was a tremendous turnout, and it was a wonderful day. God is blessing our church, and I wonder if a pastor from 100 years from now could come back in time and talk to us. What would he say to this congregation? And so it's important for us to remember. I think it's important for us to remember what God does in our life and in the lives of our churches year after year, decade after decade, century after century. I pastored a church over in East Texas, Mount Moriah Baptist Church in Omaha, Texas, and they were founded in 1850. Texas had been a state, I believe, 1 year at that point. And what a legacy. And you think about the founding of this nation, and the bedrock of that founding of this nation was church after church, in community after community, in state after state, how God has used his churches for thousands of years to transform countries. We don't know these things and think about these things too much unless we are tortured with a church history class in seminary, where it is astonishing how a professor can take the beauty of our history and boil it down to an excruciating exam. But honestly, how God has worked in so many generations, so many states, so many countries, in so many lives over the generations. And we should remember. All right, just a word there. By the way, there's nothing wrong with meaningful tradition. The church is always one generation short of extinction, if you think about it. If we don't pass on to our children and our grandchildren what God has done for us and our fathers, the church will die of apathy or ignorance. Psalm 34:11 says, "Come, my children, listen to me. I will teach you the fear of the Lord." I fear on Judgment Day, God is saying to so many of us that the reason that our country has become so lost spiritually is because we've failed in one simple task: to instill in our children and our grandchildren the faith that God has given us. So tradition can be very important. Now, it's when tradition gradually becomes traditionalism that we get into trouble. Theologian Jaroslav Pelikan said, "Tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living." It can just become ritual, and we don't want that. The Jews in the provinces finished their fighting on the 13th day of Adar and spent the next day celebrating. But since the Jews in Shushan were still defending themselves on the 14th day, they didn't get to celebrate until the 15th day. In the beginning, the Jews were united in their victory, but divided in their celebration. It all depended on whether you lived in the city or in the country. Mordecai, however, later issued a letter that instructed all the Jews to celebrate on both the 14th and 15th days of the month. And we see that in our chapter tonight, chapter 9, verse 20. Today, the Jews begin their celebration. This is how Jews celebrate in the 21st century, the Feast of Purim. They begin their celebration with a fast on the 13th day of the month, commemorating the day on which Haman's evil decree was issued. They go to the synagogue and hear the book of Esther publicly read, and whenever the name of Haman is mentioned, they cry out, may he be accursed, or may his name perish. Children bring a special Purim rattle called a Gregor, and use it to make noise every time they hear Haman's name read. I like that. Sound effects when Scripture's read. On the morning of the 14th day of the month, Jews again go to the synagogue where the Esther story is read again, and the congregation engages in prayer. The story about Moses and the Amalekites in Exodus chapter 17 is also read. Then the celebrants go home to a festive holiday meal with gifts and special foods, and the celebrating continues to the next day. They also send gifts and food to the poor and needy so that everybody can rejoice together. Again, as I said a while ago, the name Purim is the plural of the Babylonian word pur, or pur, which means lot, and originates from Haman's casting of lots to determine the day the Jews would be destroyed. All right, any comments or questions about chapter 9? Yes?
I just can't help but wonder the parallel between this story and the Holocaust. And like, what went wrong?
Yes, and I'm sure there were many Jews in the Holocaust wondering the very same thing. And as awful as the Holocaust was, I have to accept that God is sovereign and he was fully aware. And I think that when we get to heaven, because God sees history in its totality and the history of the Jewish people in its totality, not just in this generation or in the generation of World War II or in that generation. He sees all of their history. And he ultimately has a purpose, and it may have very well been, in part, what little I am able to conceive or what little we're able to understand is it was out of the horrors of World War II that we supported Israel as they went back to Israel and refounded their nation in 1948. I wonder if that would have happened had it not been for the Holocaust. I'm not saying the Holocaust was good, but God in his brilliance was able to work good out of that horrible, terrible situation so that they are back in their nation to this day. Yes?
Yeah, well, in the New Testament it says he brought out the bones, he put skin on them and put life into them. That's a good analogy. The Holocaust was destruction. They were burned, they were killed.
Yeah.
And then the nation all brought back.
Out of ashes. Yeah, that's very true. Anyway, and so, yes.
I got actually two questions.
Okay.
Were the 10 sons of Haman killed in verse 9, and were they hung in verse 13? Or the same verse? Same chapter?
He only had 10 sons, so I've got to think that they killed them and then they hung them up. Now, for us, hanging, they have to be alive because we hang them by a rope, but their hanging was impaling. And so I guess they were already dead and they wanted to display their bodies as a warning.
They were impaled on a stake or something?
Yeah, they were impaled. That's how Persians hung people. They hung them not by the neck, which would have been way preferable for me, by the way, than the alternative. But at least they were dead when they were hung, impaled.
Calls Haman an Agagite. Now, which people did Saul not kill the king? Was it?
That is back in, and I read that back in, what did I say? Oh my goodness. I tell you what, I'll confirm that later.
Okay.
But I'm assuming it was, whatever that reference was, they...
I was thinking Agagites were long sworn enemies of God's people. Not
Yes, right. Whoever it was, Saul was supposed to wipe them out and he didn't do it. Yeah. Okay. All right, any other questions about chapter 9? Okay, let's wrap it up. Chapter 10. Maybe the shortest chapter in the Old Testament. I don't know, but it's pretty short. King Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire to its distant shores. What is a tribute? Yeah, he established the IRS throughout the empires to its distant shores, and all his acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king had raised him, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. It is extraordinary how one person in the right place at the right time who listens to God can make a difference in history. So that's the whole chapter right there. So this brief chapter tells us that Mordecai, unlike his predecessor Haman, used his office to serve the king and help the Jews. Sometimes when people are elevated to high office, they forget their roots and ignore the needs of the common people. Mordecai wasn't that kind of man. Even though his political deeds are recorded in the official annals of the empire, what he did for his people has been recorded by the Lord and will be rewarded, which is fascinating if you think about his deeds were recorded in the official records of the empire, of which we do not have. But they were written down in probably what would be considered at the time insignificant, obscure writing in the book of Esther. And now that's what's really famous throughout all the centuries and why he is remembered. Why did the author mention the new tax program of King Xerxes? What does this have to do with Mordecai and the Jews? Why would you devote a chapter to that? Some Bible students think it was Mordecai who engineered this new system of tribute as a substitute for war and plunder as a source of kingdom wealth. Now that there was peace in the kingdom, the Jews were free to work, earn money, and prosper. And the prosperity of the Jews increased the prosperity of the kingdom and the empire in general. Mordecai reminded the king that the throne deserved to share in that prosperity. After all, it was the king who had chosen Esther, a Jewess, and promoted Mordecai, a Jew, and all three of them had worked together to save the Jews from destruction. Did not the people of the empire, Jews and Gentiles alike, have an obligation to their monarch? But the important message in this chapter is that God continued to use Mordecai to help the Jewish people. It wasn't just a one-time thing for Mordecai. He continued to serve year after year after year, and God blessed him. The exciting drama of Esther is over, but the blessings go on. God preserved the Jewish nation so that we today can have a Bible and a Savior. That's what God's big plan was, by the way, and his plan was fulfilled. All right, any comments about either chapter? All right, take a look at that. Concludes our Bible study for tonight. By the way, next week we begin what? The book of Job, as I like to tell my children. The book of Job. And so we'll look at that next week. Fascinating book, by the way.